Okay, so today we will have the presentation on success and challenges of supporting resilience perspective in a regulatory agency. So we are very thankful for Jenny Colman. She has a background in ergonomics and human factors, specialized on forensic and system level ergonomics, and she had done a master at the Lund University, and she has 11 years experience from different industries, and we are very fortunate to have her presentation today. The way that we will run the presentation is that we appreciate when we are not talking that we mute our mics, and Jenny will have the presentation with the slide that you have, and you can ask questions. We will run the presentation around 45, 50, 55 minutes, and the last minutes we can have additional questions, and then I will present what will be the subject for the next webinar. So it would be very appreciated if we mute when we are not talking. I think that I have covered most of the things, and we have started the recording, and thank you very much, Jenny. The floor is yours. I will pass you, and I will mute my phone.
Great, thank you so much, Yvonne. So thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present to the group. I mean, you know, we've been involved in the resilience perspective now for over a decade, and you know, we certainly had a lot of successes and a lot of challenges. I think more successes than actually we probably anticipated after graduating from the Lund program. So just it's nice to have the opportunity to chat with you today and sort of talk to you a little bit about the applied research that we've done in this field, and kind of share with you some of the successes and challenges that we've had, and also really to get your feedback around, you know, from a regulatory perspective, how could the regulator then actually assist in moving industries forward with this perspective? So just to start off then, I've just put a slide up of Vancouver. Many of you may know the city or may not know the city, and here we are in the summertime. We don't quite look like this at the moment. We're kind of grey and foggy and a bit raining today, so that's our typical winter, but we are mild, so that's kind of nice for the temperatures here. And I hear that our local ski hills have lots of snow, so that's always a benefit to visiting us in the winter time. So if you're ever in Vancouver, our team here would love to meet you and chat more about these principles and this approach. So yeah, but so let's get started with some of the content here. So who is WorkSafeBC? Let me give you a little bit of a background. Some of you, of course, will be outside of the province and outside of Canada, but WorkSafeBC is a statutory agency that's mandated with providing health and safety for the province of British Columbia. And here in Canada, we have provinces across Canada that have their own separate health and safety entities. So WorkSafeBC is the provincial regulator for British Columbia. We're based on a no-fault insurance system, and this was based on a 1917 historical compromise where workers gave up the right to sue their employers for the right to compensation and rehabilitation. So WorkSafeBC in itself is a very, very large organization that has the claim side of the business, also the insurance, the assessment premium side of the business, which is our primary source of funding. And we also have the prevention side of it. And the prevention team, we have field prevention officers and also specialized prevention staff. And our prevention officers are out on a daily basis, educating, consulting, and enforcing with industry. So they're sort of the boots on the ground, the front line, if you were, with a lot of our industries. So British Columbia is really made up of a lot of small employers. There's about 80% small employers and about 20% of larger employers. So we as an agency, we have to be scalable to managing the health and safety needs of small employers as well as very large employers. So, and again, we have different tools in the toolbox to be able to do that. So who we regulate all types of industries here in British Columbia. We regulate manufacturing, construction, healthcare, forestry, retail industry, hospitality. Our counterparts in the regulatory world, we have the Transportation Safety Board here in Canada, and they regulate the railways, the marine, aviation and pipelines. We also have our federal counterparts, which is the HRSDC, and they do regulate things like bank, telecommunications and transportation systems. We have the Ministry of Mines and Energy. And we also have another counterpart called Technical Safety BC, which do fairgrounds, elevators, technical components, escalators, things like that. So you can see how we've got a multi-agency approach, and we have our own jurisdiction, but we have a lot of overlap with the other jurisdictions as well. So when we talk about regulations, most of our regulations is what we would describe as being prescriptive regulations. And it's very much, in terms of the how-to, what an employer must do to provide a health and safety workplace. So we have some performance regulations relating to musculoskeletal injuries, violence prevention, that type of thing. But we also have safety critical regulations like confined space entry, fall protection, and those type of things. Now, when we're looking at British Columbia here, there's no requirement for a safety management system for any employer to have a safety management system, only a safety program as required by the regulation. And the regulations are seen as the absolute minimum standard that an employer must meet. So, and I think in some ways that's the value of the regulation, because it is seen as a minimum. And an employer here in British Columbia can certainly go beyond, and hopefully will go beyond, the minimum regulation, and has the ability then to put in place mechanisms and maybe adopt a safety differently, safety to approach in their own internal safety management systems. So that's really the value that, we're the minimum. An employer hopefully will start to invest into the safety management system of their choice, and hopefully that will include some of the resilience perspectives. So starting out really, back in 2002, WorkSafeBC adopted the investigation methodology, which is called ISIM, and it's the Integrated Safety Investigation Model methodology. For the purposes of learning, and this was with us for more than a decade, and it's a really a model that's really well-founded in that way for learning, because it provides an opportunity to look at an incident investigation through the resilience lens. Really, when we're looking at human performance in context, we're looking at sense making, and it really facilitates a multidisciplinary approach that everybody has an equal voice. And we were able to explore really through this investigation model, looking at various investigations over the decade that our team was positioned there, looking at, how is human performance influenced by context? The performance variability piece, and how do we actually then get our voice out to communicate out to industry in terms of recommendations and safety improvements. So over the years as well, since graduating from the Lund program in 2010, there's been tremendous opportunities for internal and external learnings with employers. And what was interesting, we found that when we first graduated and started doing certainly the human factors approach to safety and incident investigation workshops, there wasn't a lot of chatter really, or a lot of people that were sort of tapping into the resilience perspective at that time. When we would talk and offer some examples of, the work of Eric Honegel, Sidney Decker, David Woods, Richard Cook, the names were fairly, I wouldn't say unknown, but the minority certainly didn't know the people at the helm of this. And what was interesting now, I think back, when we move forward in the 10 years, and when we do the incident investigation workshops now, the names are quite well known. Things are shifting, and the majority of the people are hearing about the approach. research, and they have done some of the readings, and it's filtering through the industry groups. And so it's really positive to be able to see that the message is really spreading to a very wide level. So on the conferences, webinars, and workshops, I think one of the benefits of working, one of the main successes that we've had with working inside of a regulator is that we've had terrific leverage, because in the province of British Columbia, WorkSafeBC has a lot of credibility. And, you know, after we'd graduated from the program, myself and my colleague, Heather Colley there, you know, as individuals, we would have had less of an ability to sort of spread the message and work with the approach, I think, as individuals, other than working with WorkSafeBC. WorkSafeBC has really opened up the door for us to be able to deliver out a message and really leverage the message without throughout all industry groups. And part of that has been the biannual human factors community of practice, where we've had speakers come through. We've heard Eric Honegal himself speak to our senior executives in our auditorium here. We've had Ivan Papadilli a couple of times talking about talking to our prevention officers and also to our internal staff. We've had the pleasure of inviting Ron Gant here and Garth Hunt from our St. Paul Hospital. And on 2 occasions, we've been able to partner with our local university here and offer resilience in healthcare, where, you know, we've had Eric and Sydney and Richard Cook and Rob Robson, and we've even, you know, David Woods has been here with our Association of Canadian Ergonomists. So with the community of practice, it's really provided us that leverage and that outreach and that credibility, which is, I think, afforded us opportunities. And that's one of our main successes, really, about delivering the messages out to industry. And of course, with the long-term initiatives that stem from individual accidents is one of those things that we carry forward from investigations. And when we look at investigations, these are 2 sort of the higher profile investigations that we'd worked on over the years. And you can see, unfortunately, on the left-hand side, there's a garbage truck and there's a pedestrian overpass sitting on top of its cab when it's on one of our major highways here. And on the right-hand side, we've got a shed at a disused mine site. And unfortunately, that was a 4-person fatality with 2 mine staff and 2 paramedics that went into the space, and it was an oxygen deficient atmosphere. So when we look at the investigations and we look at the approach, and these are a couple of investigations that we do a lot of training and education on, with the TSB, with the model, with the Transportation Safety Board model, in looking then at, you know, understanding, let's offer an explanation as to why these events actually happened. And I think without having something like the investigation methodology this way, it opened up the opportunity, really, to tell the story of how human factors, system safety, the perspectives of resilience are embedded in these investigations and the recommendations that came out of those investigations. And ultimately, of course, that's our purpose of doing investigations, is for learning and for making effective recommendations that these events never happen again. And with the Transportation Safety Board investigation methodology, we're really able to explore this around why did it make sense for these individuals to do what they were doing, and let's look at their human performance in context and being able to communicate out those results. So we've had a lot of success with the model at the time. So some of the challenges, and I do remember when we graduated back in 2010, and a conversation with Sydney Decker before we left the program, and he said, you know, from what you've learned over the last couple of years, it may be challenging to go back inside a regulatory agency that's, you know, mostly, like I say, based on prescriptive regulations, and work with some of these principles, theories, applications of it. And when we came back, we certainly felt that that we were like, okay, how are we going to do this inside this agency? It's a traditional health and safety agency that has a very in some ways, rigid structure to it in terms of health and safety. And how are we actually going to be able to do this? And I remember having a conversation with one of our VPs, and she was sort of saying, you know, if you want things to change, you need to kind of shine the light, and you need to put a spotlight on it, and you need to shine the light internally, but also externally, because what will happen is the industry will start to listen, and they'll start to ask questions, and they'll start to become curious. And once industry becomes curious, then it opens up a conversation with the regulator. And I thought that was really good advice. And she was very one of our early adopters and our champions around some of the messaging and some of the outreach and the success that we have been able to have. So I think if any of you are in the position where there's challenges of adopting the view, having those adopters to support you in the journey, I think it's really, really important. So going out and communicating then around, you know, with our different stakeholders, we have unions, we have very influential stakeholders, you know, we have a board of directors, we have other people, health and safety associations and that type of thing. We have some, of course, our families of the workers in British Columbia. We have very influential stakeholders that then are starting to understand more of the messaging and starting to ask more of the questions. So this was one of our first opportunities when she was talking about, you know, shining that light and getting some applied research out there and liaising with industry and understanding how this approach and these principles would actually be meaningful to industry. This was really our first opportunity. And if you can see in the blue text there that there was a fall or death review panel for the harvesters, as you can see in the picture. Back in 2008, and they were mystified, as you can see, right, that were challenged by the notion that experienced, knowledgeable followers would fail to recognize seemingly obviously hazards. And there was 8 deaths that year, and so they called for an inquiry. And as you can see in some of the text there, that they called upon the human factors team at WorkSafeBC to look at this through a different lens. And I think that was one of our first opportunities then to really start to understand the context of this work environment and how these principles will actually apply. So this was in part myself and Heather Colley's thesis work, and we actually went out to talk to fallers and got their stories and got their experiences and got some of the context of the environment and understood the nature of the work and some of the risks and challenges that they experience. Now, as you can imagine, falling in British Columbia here, we have some very, very large timber, and our manual tree fallers are going up to very steep slopes that are virtually inaccessible these days because mechanized falling can certainly take the smaller trees on the lower slopes. So it's pushing these workers fall further and further up the mountainside to go and get these trees. So they've got long days, they're carrying a lot of kit, you know, they're carrying the chainsaw and the gas for the chainsaw and all of the other kit that they need. And they're sort of packing this upside the mountain, and then they're working alone because the regulation states that you can't work within 2 tree lengths of each other for safety. So communicating with each other and how do they actually work in this very high risk environment. So this was really the first time to get the perspective out into a very traditional industry group. So this was some of the findings then from some of our research, and we really tapped into this then, normal people doing normal work, and you can see some of their narratives and some of their discussions that they had with us. And we really just wanted them to kind of feel comfortable. We'd set up these interviews. We went up to the north part of our Vancouver Island here, which is quite remote. And we gave them, you know, at least an hour or so to kind of talk about what does normal work look like, you know, how do you actually manage this? And when it comes to the rules and the regulations that's set by the regulator and their industry group, how do those actually apply to the work that you do? And you can see from some of the narratives that they gave us back, in terms of talking about, you know, it's the knowledge and the experience that is gained from being in the forest. And the greatest value is listening to the stories of other fallers that have had these experiences. and building their repertoire of skills and knowledge. So you can see then how the narratives really did quite closely match the perspective of Eric Hornigal when we're talking about normal people doing normal work in that type of environment. So further on then, what they talked about really, and it was kind of interesting in the interviews, you know, we did give them an hour, but once you get people talking about the work that they do and a profession that they love to do, and they as not as physically demanding and strenuous as it is, they do actually love to do this work. They're out in the mountainside, and you know, physically challenging, cognitively challenging, and they really do love this environment, and this is why they've chosen this profession. But they talk about the fact that, you know, we need to do this, you know, almost physics on the fly when it comes to the tree, and it building that sort of tacit innate knowledge around how the trees are going to shift and move and pivot. And they talk about this intelligent adaptation. And once the profession is truly learned, they talk about this measure of true professionalism to be able to balance the complexity of the work environment, the demands of the other work pressures. It's not a profession that lends itself to rigid rule following in that way. So you can see how some of the theories then in their conversation are well supported in resilience when we talk about the efficiency thoroughness trade-off, the trade-off always between, you know, productivity, quality, and safety. And you know, when we went back to talk to industry around the, you know, results, it was probably the first time this industry group had actually heard the discussion around, well, there's work as imagined and work as done, and this is a very typical example of these principles in practice. So during our interviews with the folders, this is just one of the things this is just a model or a bit of a sort of concept in some ways, because we were talking to them a little bit about some new concepts and theories that they hadn't likely have heard about. And so this was just an easy way of kind of explaining you know, what is it that we wanted to know? Obviously, you have a set of technical skills. You know how to fell a tree. It's like driving a car. But now you put felling a tree in that type of environment where you're looking at steep slopes, changes in weather all of the time, trees that are intertangled with one another, you know, communication difficulties potentially. You know, it's a very, very challenging environment to be in those kind of remote conditions. And we wanted to know then, how do you apply those technical skills in context? And again, they talked, you know, in their own language, but you could see that the principles were well supported around this performance variability. And they actually, in their own words, of course, were talking about, you know, the fact that people, you know, if you're new to this profession and you're practicing purely on technical skills, in their voice, they found that scary. So in some ways, you know, you have a set of regulations that you're practicing that technical skill, but unless they're more fluid and you lose that rigidity out of regulation, then they feel the people that are practicing almost like the work to rule in some ways are actually scary to be around in terms of that, and they felt that being that rigid didn't actually contribute to safety. So one of the things with the traditional approach then, because we were, you know, bringing this research and these findings back to that industry group that were entrenched in a traditional view. And this was part of the thesis work as well, that we had felt that you know, how well it would be received, because I think traditional safety practitioners often will be uncomfortable with the resilience perspective, because there's currently no way of assessing what level or, you know, what does safe actually look like? Because in this industry group, what safe looks like is that you have people, experts, that would go out and they would look at the stump after a tree's been felled and actually get out the tape measure and measure the undercut and the back cut and the depth and the angles and that type of thing. But the messaging was quite opposite from the people that fell the trees, you know, the manual tree fallers that are saying, you know, the focus on the technical skills, you lose that ability to see the context. And that's the technical skills they felt that point wasn't an indicator of whether they were safe or not safe. So it's really having that industry group then to kind of open up the door and let's rethink around then what does safety actually look like and how is it accessed? And I think that's a whole new conversation really for the industry to have had, to understand then if it's the development of the skill and the expertise, the discretion and the judgment and the ability to be fluid with rules and regulation in the context of their work environment, then it's like, how do we actually start to enhance that skill set for them to be able to succeed under varied conditions in that way? So over the years, then you know, the investigations have been a little bit of one of our challenging areas, I think, because how the regulation is laid out, and the regulation is quite prescriptive. And in some ways, the structure of the regulation, when we look at an investigation, what can happen is the investigation can become quite binary. It can become mechanistic because the regulation is quite specific around certain interactions that you have at a job site. So, like a forklift example that we'd have here, you could break this down to discrete items. And what tends to happen with obviously the cause and effect, there tends to be that benchmark of performance to regulation. And without really having a resilience perspective, you know, overcoming this hindsight around this sense-making piece and why does it make sense to do what the illustration shows, I think it's a really big hurdle in some ways for, you know, some of the investigations that we have, because not all investigators, of course, are privy to the incident, to the approach, and they have more of a challenging time, I think, when you're trying to use regulation as a base to investigate rather than a resilience perspective. So these are still remain to be some of our challenges, but I think without having perhaps that resilience perspective, it's very, very difficult to put yourself into a place of understanding of why these actions and these decisions would make sense, and the organizational structure around this type of event at the workplace. And so, you know, really going back to the investigation methodology, that really provided us that opportunity for sense making. But certainly in our early days, and still to this day, there are some challenges with these type of current thinking inside the regulator when it comes to investigations. So, but I want to add then too, but the core value, I think, if you ask any of our prevention officers that, you know, are out there liaising with industry on a day-to-day basis, the core value and certainly the mission and the values of our organization is for workers to go home, you know, safe and well at the end of the day. And part of that would be, you know, for workers to succeed under varied conditions. We don't want employers to be so rigid with rule following that workers are no longer protected, and they need to have that you know, safety management system framework in some ways in their own internal processes to be able to protect the workers and have them succeed under varied conditions. So what we've really come to learn over the decade, a lot of people ask us when we do our outreach, our training, our education, our workshops and this type of thing, and what model do I use? What methodologies do we use? And we really have sort of talked more about the importance of, well, what is your perspective? You know, are your workers your assets or are they your liabilities? What do you feel? How do you feel about people in your system? What's their contribution to safety? Yeah, so we really try to drive home the message around, you know, your perspective drives everything, and what you look for is really what you find. And you know, regardless of the methods and the methodologies that you may have, you may use, you know, taproot, you may use tripod beta, you may use root cause analysis, you may use appreciative inquiry, whatever it is that you're using, whatever's in your toolbox. But we feel like, you know, talking to industry over the last 10 years, perspective drives everything. And it's the perspectives really around that contribution of people in your workplace system and what their contribution actually is, and what is your perspective on error, what is the language that you use. Because even though we go out and educate on the Transportation Safety Board investigation model, you can still see people struggle with it if they don't have the right language or they don't have the right perspective. So this is something that we spend a lot of time on communicating around, you know, the perspective, the language, your outlook, and it should just be in part of everything that you do. And this is, you know, when you're adopting a resilience perspective, it's completely infiltrated throughout the entire organization when it comes to safety, efficiency, productivity, quality. And if you can think of it more of a mindset and an approach rather than, you know, give me the checklist or the tools or this or that, the methodologies, it's more of that outlook. And so we really try to drive this home because, you know, if people don't adopt the language and the perspective, then they have a really difficult time with any of the models and the methodologies that are currently available. So we don't place a lot of emphasis on the models and methodologies. We really place a huge amount of emphasis on the perspective with the industry group, and we work really hard to try and think about how they would, you know, what they would write in an investigation report, how they would communicate their recommendations, and those type of things. So when we're looking internally at our own investigations or methodologies as such, we use the methodology here called appreciative inquiry to look at the work of the silviculture industry, specifically the tree planters. And the participatory action research was, we partnered with a couple of consultants from MIT, Tom Victor-Payton and Clarissa Sawyer, and we looked then around, you know, how does successful work actually happen? So this was very similar to the work that we did with the manual tree fallers group. So our organization, because we've got that other side of us that is claims and injuries and those type of things, we have a lot of statistics. What our statistics will tell us about this occupational group is that they have a very, very high injury rate. So what we looked at was a little bit different here. We looked at through an appreciative inquiry lens, we looked at then, let's look at the people that don't have injuries and how do they manage this type of environment. And similar to the manual tree fallers, as you can imagine, it's very, very strenuous work. Long shifts, long consecutive days, remote areas. And so we interviewed a lot of the silviculture workers to then understand what are the challenges and the constraints of your work. And this was the model that we used for our appreciative inquiry to understand then, so what doesn't work for you? What are your challenges and what are your constraints? And in turn, those are positive discoveries because those are something we can proactively do something about. Let's have the ability to collect data on what goes right, and let's build upon what goes right, and let's actually replicate it, what works and what is actually intended. And so a qualitative model of appreciative inquiry in terms of through stories and narratives, again, around sharing their experiences around what does go well and how do they actually manage this type of environment. So we went into this research with a systems approach, and this is a systems approach that we use a lot for our training and education, and it's the interaction based on, of course, human factors ergonomics is a well-known kind of model of looking at what are the people, what do they bring? What's their contribution to safety and to this work environment? What is the facility that they're working in? What is the environment that they're working in? And what is the management system that surrounds those people and the facility? And the shaded area, of course, is the interaction of those three things. And we never take the people out in isolation, but we always look at this triad in union in that way to understand what is the influence of the work environment and the management system on the worker's performance. So it's situated iterating performance always within that context of that system, work system. And then we understand then, so the effects of, piece rate work, so the more you plant, the more you get paid, the long hours, consecutive days, the weight of the seedlings that are coming out of the nursery, and sort of scaling it back to systems within systems, and how they actually plant in this type of terrain. I mean, often you are putting a shovel into rock to try and get a seedling in place to establish it, and how they talk about that type of environment around, you're always looking ahead to the next planting of the next placement or where it's going to be. So moving forwards, our team now is embedded in what we call the risk analysis unit, the RAU, and it was actually set up. This unit was actually set up after we had two very high profile, two very high significant, unfortunately, of loss of life and injuries, two mill explosions, sawmill explosions in the northern part of our province, relating to dust explosions, unfortunately. So the risk analysis unit was set up because, like I said, traditionally our organization as a regulator, a lot of our safety initiatives from that we do with outreach of industry have always been claims driven, and we have a lot of claims data, and we can see where the injuries are actually occurring through the industry groups or the occupations or whatever it might be, with construction or manufacturing, healthcare. But this was a little bit different because these two mill explosions kind of shook our organization to the core in some ways. They were within a few weeks of each other, and we had the one and then we had the second one, and so we had two very detailed investigations on these dust explosions at these sawmills. And the organization shifted and sort of said, okay, we need to look at safety in a different way, and we need to look at it through a risk-based lens. And these are risks that perhaps we have absolutely no claims data for, and it requires a different approach. And so the team was basically set up, and we have a team of certainly statisticians and investigation specialists, and the human factors team is here. And so we have a well-rounded group. We have hygienists and things like that to look at industry risks from a different perspective. And we're basically constantly filtering out, news from around the globe to say, could it happen here in British Columbia? If there's been sort of catastrophic incidences, what we're talking about, low frequency, high consequences, like the two sawmill explosions were, and could it happen here in BC? Do we have those type of industries? Do we have those type of processes? And how do we get ahead of the game and actually start to assist industry in understanding then what the risks are and how to manage those risks? So part of then the regulator is shifting then to be more proactive, to looking at things through a risk-based lens. And with emerging technologies and different industries coming into British Columbia, such as say cannabis manufacturing, or we're currently looking at electric vehicles or hydrogen fuel cells. These are the new industries in British Columbia, and how do we actually manage the health and safety of those workers, in these type of new industries? So it's getting to whilst having the opportunity to actually go out to these industry groups then that may already have established safety paradigms, and sort of saying, how do you do what you do, and how do we replicate what goes well? So within the risk analysis unit now, there is that opportunity to practice more the resilience perspective, because we're really supporting an industry in understanding them. What are your risks and how are you managing them, and how do we learn as an organization so we can then start communicating out? We've got a lot of resources to be able to communicate out and deliver out the message. And in some ways, we have that opportunity to use the RMAL framework, which is the respond, monitor, anticipate, and learn framework, by having this more of an appreciative or a curious outlook, and trying to proactively assist industries in managing the risks. Now, what I will say we're currently looking as well at helping some of our process-related industries in some of this perspective as well. So we have chemical and pulp and paper, and we have wood pellet manufacturing, and some of the newer biogas and biomass industries and that type of thing here in British Columbia. So we're currently also working with some of our process industries, and process safety for our agency is quite a new domain. And so that's new territory for us, and we're one of the first regulators in Canada, actually, that's looking at process safety, because there are no process safety regulations in Canada. And we have no process safety regulations inside our own organization. We have the Workers' Compensation Act that sort of covers a general duty of care, but we have no specific or prescriptive or even performance regulations when it comes to process safety. So now we can sort of come out as an agency with a different perspective, with a different viewpoint, and understand then how do we looking at risk and how do we manage them. But what's interesting, I think, sometimes is that the industry themselves feel, especially with the process safety industries, some of them are very traditional industries like the pulp and paper and some of our chemical manufacturing, some of the oil and gas, and feel like, well, the regulator's asking for process safety, they must want, bankers' boxes of paperwork, and that's actually what we're asking for. We're asking in a very simplistic way, can you communicate what your risks are and how are you actually managing them? How do you demonstrate to us that you are managing them without producing reams and reams of paperwork? And I think that there's a bit of a disconnect in industry sometimes when we're thinking around, they feel like to prove to the regulator what they actually need is paperwork, and it's not often paperwork that we need. We need to actually be able to demonstrate that you have safety mechanisms in place that are going to be effective and appropriate when the time comes, if you have the escalation of a significant event in your plant. So that's more of the kind of the macro lens. Going back to the micro lens, I have been working with the process control operators in the wood pellet manufacturing plants in British Columbia here, and they tend to be in our northern part of the region. And our wood pellet manufacturers take a raw wood product of, sometimes it's been already somewhat refined through a sawmill process, and it was typically a waste wood. This is a new industry group that has been generated through environmental concerns about waste wood, and they're manufacturing them into waste pellets for heating systems. And a lot of these waste wood pellets are actually getting then shipped over to Europe. But what I wanted to do, again, is look at this, how resilience is operationalized within this type of industry group, within the day in the life of the process control operator. So what I did is I arranged to go to some of the plants, and I actually sat with the operator for their 12-hour shifts over 2 days and tried to then tap into this normalized work. Let's forget about, perhaps there's somebody from WorkSafeBC sitting in the chair next to you, and let's really see how they're able to actually work with this system under this framework of respond, monitor, anticipate, and learn. And so I took it again down to that micro level of understanding, when they've got wood coming into their system, there's a loader operator that's loading into the wood. The wood's going to be to dry to a certain temperature, then it's going to be processed into through pelletizers, and they have to produce a pellet that's standardized, that meets quality standards at the end of this. So it's quite the process, and it's a very, very variable process, because you could have different moisture levels or different species of wood coming on of the intake. So it's how do they manage the variability in the system? So at the endpoint, you have a very high variability, and at the endpoint, you need very, very low variability. So I used, again, this framework for this to have this perspective, because certainly I was looking at the interface, and I was looking at the design and some of their graphics and some of their alarm management systems. But overall, I was taking this perspective of like, so how do you respond to the changes in the system? This system is not something that responds to spontaneity. You have to, any of the system parameters, you need to adjust very slowly, very incrementally. So if you have more wet wood coming into the feed and you have to increase the temperature of your dryer to compensate for that, how are you doing it? How are you monitoring the data that's coming through the interface of the design that you have? How are you actually anticipating changes in the system when it comes to the wood species or the moisture levels? And again, how are you as process control operators as a group? How are you learning and how are you sharing that information with your shift handovers and that type of thing? And again, you know, how does industry assist these process control operators with skill development in that way? We really like to be able to see. I mean, it's a huge investment, and hopefully over time, things will change with their interface graphics and their alarm management systems. But overall, how are we helping the operators? Because they really are the primary. They're the key one of the key members in keeping the system in safe parameters. They're constantly monitoring, adjusting, and tweaking the performance of the system. And so, we really want to say, how are we enhancing the skill set of these people to be able to be more resilient within their system and keep the system within safe parameters. So that's another micro example of how we've used the framework. Now, the organization, just to really finish up then, in summary, when we look at, you know, the bell curve of successful work and what goes well and what doesn't go well, you know, in light of the work that we do here within our regulatory industry and our claims management system and all of the workplace injuries that we have every single day, of course, we spend a lot of time, the majority of our time as an organization is responding to what goes wrong, unfortunately, and that's a big part of our business, and that's very, very unfortunate that we spend so much time looking at what's going wrong, and what has gone wrong. I mean, our field officers are inundated with, you know, phone calls from workplaces to say that, you know, they need to pay a visit because they feel that there's unsafe work practices occurring and that type of thing. So a lot of our time for our prevention teams are focusing in on just response work and that type of thing. Our claims management system, of course, is responding to people's rehabilitation and compensation and that side of the business. But in that center part of it where, you know, we can look at successful work, I think that's the lens through what we now currently have through the risk analysis unit. And there's great opportunity, I think, there to really be able to kind of tap into the resilience approach and really then start, you know, affecting certainly the response work that we have to do, and also, but to the right side, you know, looking at what goes well, we have an established communication marketing team here at WorkSafeBC, and they're really champions of any employer that's doing things well and getting that message out, and really understanding then around, you know, let's promote success. What is going well? What are employers doing right? And we actually publish a quarterly magazine here at WorkSafeBC that actually tries to promote positive work practices in that way for other employers to look at and replicate, and that's widely available. So in terms of our messaging, so but in terms of, you know, moving forward, I think in terms of our team here would love to have your feedback around what does the next decade really look like for a regulatory agency. You know, this is something that we're curious about. Like I say, we're doing some great work inside the risk analysis unit, and certainly other departments that we have. We have our industry and labour services that also do industry outreach, and there's people here that are very dedicated, being very proactive in safety and adopting some of the safety differently and resilience views around safety. But we're curious, and we would love to have your feedback either online now, or, you know, please get in touch with us on email. But what does the next decade look at? What is the role of prevention, occupational health and safety agencies such as WorkSafeBC? how could an agency like WorkSafeBC assist with safety too, and the resilience perspective? How could public and stakeholders support an agency like WorkSafeBC adopt safety too? So how could that larger messaging or that outlook or that perspective for, for families, for unions, for, our health and safety associations, industry groups themselves, how could they actually adopt a different approach and actually then support the regulator in turn? So we really invite your feedback on any this perspective. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions. Yvonne, if that's an appropriate time to do it here.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. Such a nice presentation. And could you leave the questions on that you have in the last slide? And is there any questions around the table? I see that we have 23 people attending. Some of your work is related also to the work that Beth is conducted. I don't know if there are some questions, please.
Jenny, this is Beth Lay. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
Very good. I was excited to see that you were covering tree felling. And I wonder if you can go to the previous slide where you're asking how the regulator could help.
Okay, let me just shift back here. Yep.
And so we're in the U.S., so you're not our regulator, obviously, but I know we've had conversations about how OSHA could help, and some changes that we'd like to see OSHA adopt. And among them would be to adopt some of the new thinking around how to investigate events, which maybe you've already done that, which it sounds like you have, so that's thrilling. But beyond that, I think that an agency could help in bringing together people from the same industry to work on things together, such as they do already in aviation. I'd love to see someone do that for line clearance, for example.
Right. So within OSHA, I mean, do you have more of a sort of multidisciplinary agencies that come together to try and kind of promote the message collectively?
I don't, not that I know of. Some others on the call may know, but I don't know that.
Okay, interesting. So, and has OSHA had some success with the messaging?
I think, pardon me if I misspeak, but I was invited to a recent workshop with the safety leaders of probably 10 large companies. And one of the things that we noted was that OSHA is behind the times in their view of safety. And so we feel like we could have a role in that one of the important things that safety leaders can do is have a role in supporting OSHA to moving to a more modern view of safety that's based in science.
Okay. Yeah, it takes time. I mean, our organizations are, traditional in that way, and obviously, regulation always lags behind practice, and this is really what we're discovering in the risk analysis unit. The world is changing so quickly that there's new technology, new innovation coming into the workplace, and by going with prescriptive regulations, the world is changing at a faster rate that we could possibly ever change regulation. So I think within the new sort of decade, it's maybe going to have to become more performance-based regulation to accommodate how quickly the world is actually changing.
Thank you, Jenny, and I'll cede the floor to someone else.
Okay, thank you.
Hi there, Jenny. This is Spiros from Vancouver. Thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was very interesting. And this is actually part of an ongoing discussion I've been having with Jeff Litt here in Vancouver regarding the role that a regulator can play when it comes to resilience engineering and safety too and all that. My question for you is, from my experience, I've worked with quite a few different companies varying in size, and a lot of them have a tendency to sort of consider core to be the maximum in terms of best practices and whatnot. Are there any considerations to using the core program to help sort of showcase the abilities that the resilience engineering has, or to sort of, I don't know, add a form of incentive to it at the very least?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I've never really thought about it. We've often sort of talked amongst the team of maybe trying to kind of embed some of the investigation methodology inside core. But yeah, it's interesting. We haven't really thought about using core for a conduit that way. So, but that's definitely, we could open that up for discussions internally here for sure. Absolutely.
I think
There could be, you know, like I said, it's not so much would be a module in itself, but I think it could be in some ways a way of delivering the perspective and the approach and the way of thinking about things, right? So I think it could be kind of overarching in that way to try and, you know, the language and the perspective and the outlook around, you know, what is people's contribution to work. So I think, yeah, absolutely, there could well be an opportunity for that for sure.
There'd definitely be a useful aspect to it because, like I said, a lot of the times, especially for employers that may not have a lot of resource on the safety side of things, or have safety practitioners, professionals that aren't quite familiar with the resilience, and once they reach core, that tends to be sort of it, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Because core is so focused on a little bit of safety systems, but not quite as much.
I know, and
stock. Yeah.
That's often unfortunate with when you have formal programs in that way, it's kind of, it feels a bit like, oh well, we've been there, done that, and you know, we've completed it, now it goes on a shelf. I mean, I know that they have to do the ongoing audits and that type of thing for core, but you know, and that's what I'm saying in terms of, you know, the tools or the methodologies, it's more of an outlook, it's a perspective, it's your language, it's the way you think about things, you know, and it's infiltrating it to that level, I think, is where we have the greatest success. So it's whatever mechanism we can use to kind of shift the thinking a little bit, because we're not saying, you know, let's get rid of what we're currently doing, but we're saying, how do we enhance what we're currently doing? And that maybe takes that shift in thinking a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that we're trying to do in this organization is implementing a safety management system like ISO 45001 with sort of the safety to resilience engineering twist to it, because it's the best way to sort of get into the mindset to start from the basis by saying, hey, you know, we have this international management system, let's implement it. And oh, by the way, there's also these resilience engineering things attached to it. The big pushback that we've had is, well, we have core already. What's the point of going above and beyond?
Why go beyond it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, I guess, of, you know, people see these kind of formal systems of, you know, how much do you want to actually invest in safety, and you know, but that's what I was saying in terms of the perspective. I think it's so critical, but it's whatever kind of tool gives you that ability to start embracing the thinking around this. You know, it's if the safety management system is actually providing you that ability to start implementing the frameworks, and sometimes the safety management systems, in some ways, because, you know, there's overlap, they're integrated into other parts of the business, right? Safety shouldn't be seen as a standalone. So how do they think about the principles of, say, respond, monitor, anticipate, learn in their own, you know, in quality, in productivity and efficiency? Like, you know, sometimes the language and the approach needs to sort of go beyond safety a little bit and actually filter through the entire organization in some ways to sort of shift that level of thinking that, you know, some of these principles can relate to those other areas as well. And I think in some ways, there will be some success there in thinking about it from an organizational perspective rather than just from a safety perspective.
Oh, absolutely. I appreciate the answer.
Yeah, thank you. Good chatting with you.
Thank you very much, Jenny.
Thank you.
I would like to switch to my presentation to announce the next presenter. If it's okay for you, Jenny, we have opened the discussion with you and keeping how we can implement resilience engineering in practice. And it was great to have examples, concrete examples from your side, from your industry, and that you share this knowledge. And I will change presenter. So what I would like to use the last minute is to announce the next webinar next month. And we are very fortunate to have also a discussion about pragmatic tools to look into adaptations. And it's Mike Radio that is coming from the Ohio State University. And his research is focused on design work and how different teams work together, or how to use technology to coordination and to facilitate resilience performance. So looking forward for you to join us on the 19th of February. Everyone is welcome. And with that, Jenny, many thanks again for sharing your knowledge. And with that, I will close this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you.